Let's read for
Hello. Welcome back. Hey, there's
and
Kaden.
today I'm going to be reading.
Right? Stick around. It's story time. But Kaylissa is learning to read, and she has. Bring it back, Kaylissa. Thank you.
I want to read first.
You're going to. Come sit by me. And she wants to read her story first for story time.
Okay. Matt, set. Sam, set. Matt, set. Sam, set. Matt, set on Sam. Sam, set on Matt. Matt set, Sam set. The end.
Good job. I'm really proud of her. Now, if it looks like I've been crying, I have. Because we just watched Savannah Smiles, and it's the cutest movie. And if you've never seen it, go watch it because it's adorable. It's old, but it's cute.
It's a little girl that got a puppy.
Yeah, it's cute. Anyway, I got all emotional and I cried. And that's why I'm late, because I was finishing. But here we are. Oh, he's like, hey, that's my book. Hey, what are you talking about? Hey, you can't haul off with my book. Oh, he flopped on the floor. Oh my goodness.
Well, at least you get your book.
Oh, he's dead. Oh. Anyway, I'm probably going to be kind of fast tonight. I've got a lot going on, as usual. Oh my goodness.
Let me know in the
tired
comments
hit.
how I read. Let me know if you think I'm very good or just
Let her know
good.
in the comments. Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we get started, I like to ask everybody, what did you have for dinner?
Or what are you going to have for dinner?
That's right. What are you going to have for dinner? We had a casserole. I made rice, chicken, broccoli.
Are you going to have that?
Cauliflower casserole. It was really good with steamed broccoli and stuffed peppers. It was yum. Okay, and then I'm sitting in the living room. I'm not by my stuff, so I'm not going to show off all my cute stuff, but maybe next time. So we're starting Anne of Green Gables. Oh, Kaylissa will do it. She's going to go get some stuff. So Anne of Green Gables, this is number 1, first novel.
I'll show you.
Oh.
I'll show them.
That might be stuff I've already showed them, I think.
Oh.
Actually, wait, some of those aren't.
Okay.
Those ones I haven't.
I want to show off.
Wait, let me take the price tag off. Everything's way more expensive than when I made these, so I can't sell them at that price anymore. Okay. This wants to show them off. There you go.
Look, so pretty. I don't know if you can see it. There's butterflies in there.
Yeah.
Butterflies.
They're quite transparent.
I don't know if you can see it.
So they look almost glassy with little butterfly charms.
Yeah, I don't know if you can see the butterflies.
Anyway, there you go. I think these ones they might not have seen with the seashells and the purple in them.
Look at these. It's kind of confusing because it's all backwards, huh?
Yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. Okay, so chapter 1, Anne of Green Gables. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is surprised. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow, fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops, and traversed So I got it plugged in. I might have to just take the first part off and just start it from here. Whoopsie whoopsie. Okay, well, we'll start over then.
Want some lotion?
Yeah, I do. Oh, wow, that's a lot.
Well, I thought you said you want a worm.
Well, I didn't want like a giant worm. Here, you have some.
I don't want to hold a worm.
Way more than I can. Oh my goodness. That's more than I can use.
Ew.
Okay, well, I don't know what is happening because what? I'm so confused. Okay, so it died and then it made me restart and said it was starting over and then it went off and then it's like, oh my goodness. I do not know what is going on, but it's working now. So we'll just start from here. Okay. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is surprised. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow, fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops, and traversed by a brook that had its source way back in the woods of the old Cuthbert place. It was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook in its earlier course through those woods, with dark secrets of pool and cascade. But by the time it reached You're being kind of noisy. But by the time it reached Lynn's Hollow, oh, I lost my, oh. By the time it reached Lynn's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream. For not even a brook could run past Mrs. Lynn's house, could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. It probably was conscious that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed, from brooks and children up, and that if she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. There are plenty of people in Avonlea and out of it who can attend closely to their neighbor's business by dint of neglecting their own. But Mrs. Rachel Lynde was one of those capable creatures who can manage their own concerns and those of other folks into the bargain. She was a notable housewife. Her work was always done and well done. She ran the sewing circle, helped run the Sunday school, and was the strongest prop of the church aid society and foreign missions auxiliary. Yet with all this, Mrs. Rachel found abundant time to sit for hours at her kitchen window, knitting cotton warp quilts. She had knitted 16 of them, as Avonlea housekeepers were wont to tell in odd voices, and keeping a sharp eye on the main road that crossed the hollow and wound up the steep red hill beyond. Since Avonlea occupied a little triangular peninsula jutting out into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, with water on two sides of it, anybody who went out of it or into it had to pass over that hill road, and so run the unseen gauntlet of Mrs. Rachel's all-seeing eye. She was sitting there one afternoon in early June. The sun was coming in at the window warm and bright. The orchard on the slope below the house was in a bridal flush of pinky white bloom, hummed over by a myriad of bees. Thomas Lynde, a meek little man, whom Avonlea people called Rachel Lynde's husband. Poor guy, that's his whole identity. Was sowing his late turnip seed on the hill field beyond the barn, and Matthew Cuthbert ought to have been sowing his on the big red brook field way over by Green Gables. Mrs. Rachel knew that he ought because she had heard him tell Peter Morrison the evening before in William J. Blair's store over at Carmody that he meant to sow his turnip seed the next afternoon. Peter had asked him, of course, for Matthew Cuthbert had never been known to volunteer information about anything in his whole life. And yet here was Matthew Cuthbert at 3:30 on the afternoon of a busy day, placidly driving all over the hollow and up the hill. Moreover, he wore a white collar and his best suit of clothes, which was plain proof that he was going out of Avonlea. And he had the buggy and the sorrel mare, which betokened that he was going a considerable distance. Now, where was Matthew Cuthbert going, and why was he going there? Had it been any other man in Avonlea, Mrs. Rachel, deftly putting this and that together, might have given a pretty good guess as to both questions. But Matthew so rarely went from home that it must be something pressing and unusual which was taking him. He was the shyest man alive and hated to have to go among strangers or to any place where he might have to talk. Matthew dressed up with a white collar and driving in a buggy was something that didn't happen often. Mrs. Rachel, ponder as she might, could make nothing of it, and her afternoon's enjoyment was spoiled. I'll just step over to Green Gables after tea and find out from Marilla where he's gone and why, the worthy woman finally concluded. He doesn't generally go to town this time of year, and he never visits. If he'd run out of turnip seed, he wouldn't dress up and take the buggy to go for more. He wasn't driving fast enough to be going for the doctor. Yet something must have happened since last night to start him off. I'm clean puzzled, that's what, and I won't know a minute's peace of mind or conscience until I know what has taken Matthew Cuthbert out of Avonlea today. Accordingly, after tea, Mrs. Rachel set out. She had not far to go. The big rambling orchard-embowered house where the Cuthberts lived was a scant quarter of a mile up the road from Lynn's Hollow. To be sure, the long lane made it a good deal further. Matthew Cuthbert's father, as shy and silent as his son after him, had gone as far away as he possibly could from his fellow men without actually retreating into the woods when he founded his homestead. Green Gables was built at the furthest edge of his cleared land, and there it was to this day, barely visible from the main road along which all the other Avonlea houses were so sociably situated. Mrs. Rachel Lynde did not call living in such a place living at all. It's just staying, that's what, she said as she stepped along the deep rutted grassy lane bordered with wild rose bushes. It's no wonder Matthew and Marilla are both a little odd, living away back here by themselves. Trees aren't much company, though though dear knows if there were, there'd be enough of them. I'd rather look at people. To be sure, they seem contented enough, but then I suppose they're used to it. A body can get used to anything, even to being hanged, as the Irishman said. With this, Mrs. Rachel stepped out of the lane into the backyard of Green Gables. Very green and neat and precise was the yard, set about on one side with great patriarchal willows, and on the other with prim Lombardites. Not a stray stick nor stone was to be seen, for Mrs. Rachel would have seen it if there had been. Privately, she was of the opinion that Marilla Cuthbert swept that yard over as often as she swept her house. One could have eaten a meal off the ground without overbrimming the proverbial peck of dirt. Mrs. Rachel rapped smartly at the kitchen door and stepped in when bidden to do so. The kitchen at Green Gables was a cheerful apartment, or would have been cheerful if it had not been so painfully clean as to give it something of the appearance of an unused parlor. Its windows looked east and west, though the west one, looking out on the backyard, through the west one, looking out on the backyard, came a flood of mellow June sunlight. But the east one, whence you got a glimpse of the bloom-white cherry trees in the left orchard, and nodding, slender birches down in the willow by the brook, was greened over by a tangle of vines. Here sat Marilla Cuthbert, when she sat at all, always slightly distrustful of sunshine, which seemed to her too dancing and irresponsible a thing for a world which was meant to be taken seriously. And here she sat now, knitting, and the table behind her was laid for supper. Hi, baby. Hey, who's that? He likes this book. What you eating?
Some of your dessert.
I'm reading from this one. He just wants to take it so bad. There's no pictures in this one. Do you need one with pictures? Yeah.
Mine has pictures.
Yours does have pictures. Oh, here he comes. He likes the ones with pictures. He loves books. Mrs. Rachel, before she had fairly closed the door, had taken mental note of everything that was on that table. There were 3 plates laid, so that Marilla must be expecting someone home with Matthew to tea. But the dishes were everyday dishes, and there was only crabapple preserves and one kind of cake. so that the expected company could not be any particular company. Yet what of Matthew's white collar and the sorrel mare? Mrs. Rachel was getting fairly dizzy with this unusual mystery about quiet, unmysterious Green Gables. Oh, Kaden, are you making a mess? Yeah, pretty much. Oh, what did you find? Good evening, Rachel, Marilla said briskly. This is a real fine evening, isn't it? Won't you sit down? How are all your folks? Something that, for lack of any other name, might be called friendship, existed and always had existed between Marilla Cuthbert and Mrs. Rachel, in spite of, or perhaps because of, their dissimilarity. Marilla was a tall, thin woman with angles and without curves. Her dark hair showed some gray streaks and was always twisted up in a hard little knot. In a hard little knot behind, with two wire hairpins stuck aggressively through it. She looked like a woman of narrow experience and rigid conscience, which she was. But there was a saving something about her mouth which, if it had been ever so slightly developed, might have been considered indicative of a sense of humor. We're all pretty well, said Mrs. Rachel. I was kind of afraid you weren't, though, when I saw Matthew starting off today. I thought maybe he was going to the doctor's. Marilla's lips twitched understandingly. She had expected Mrs. Rachel up. She had known that the sight of Matthew jaunting off so unaccountably would be too much for her neighbor's curiosity. Oh, no, I'm quite well, although I had a bad headache yesterday, she said. Matthew went to Bright River. We're getting a little boy from an orphan asylum in Nova Scotia, and he's coming on the train tonight. If Marilla had said that Matthew had gone to Bright River to meet a kangaroo from Australia, Mrs. Rachel could not have been more astonished. She was actually stricken dumb for 5 seconds. That's a feat. It was unsupposable that Marilla was making fun of her, but Mrs. Rachel was almost forced to suppose it. Are you in earnest, Marilla? She demanded, when voice returned to her. Yes, of course, said Marilla, as if getting boys from orphan asylums in Nova Scotia were part of the usual spring work on any well-regulated Avonlea farm instead of being an unheard-of innovation. Mrs. Rachel felt that she had received a severe mental jolt. She thought in exclamation points. A boy, Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert, of all people, adopting a boy from an orphan asylum. Well, the world was certainly turning upside down. She would be surprised at nothing after this. Nothing. What on earth put such a notion into your head? She demanded disapprovingly. This had been done without her advice being asked, and must perforce be disapproved. Well, we've been thinking about it for some time, all winter, in fact, returned Marilla. Mrs. Alexander Spencer was up here one day before Christmas, and she said she was going to get a little girl from the asylum over in Hopetown in the spring. Her cousin lives there, and Mrs. Spencer has visited her and knows all about it, so Matthew and I have talked it over off and on ever since. We thought we'd get a boy. Matthew is getting up in years, you know. He's 60, and he isn't so spry as he once was. His heart troubles him a good deal. And you know how desperate hard it's got to be to get hired help. There's never anybody to be but those stupid half-grown little French boys. And as soon as you do get one broke into your ways and taught something, he's up and off to the lobster canneries of the States. At first, Matthew suggested getting a Bernardo boy, but I said no flat to that. They may be all right, I'm not saying they're not, but no London street Arabs for me. I said, give me a native born at least. There'll be a risk no matter who we get, but I'll feel easier in my mind and sleep sounder at nights if we get a born Canadian. So in the end, we decided to ask Mrs. Spencer. Oh, thanks, love. I love you. You're so full of kisses. I love you. So in the end, we decided to ask Mrs. Spencer to pick us out one when she went over to get her little girl. We heard last week she was going. So we sent her word by Richard Spencer's folks at Carmody to bring us a smart, likely boy of about 10 or 12. We decided that would be the best age, old enough to be of some use in doing chores right off, and young enough to be trained up proper. We mean to give him a good home and schooling. We had a telegram from Mrs. Alexander Spencer today. The mailman brought it from the station, saying that they are coming on the 5:30 train tonight. So Matthew went to Bright River to meet him. Mrs. Spencer will drop him off there. Of course, she goes on to White Sands Station herself. Mrs. Rachel prided herself on always speaking her mind. She proceeded to speak it now. Having adjusted her mental attitude to this amazing piece of news. Well, Marilla, I'll just tell you plain that I think what you're doing is a mighty foolish thing, a risky thing, that's what. You don't know what you're getting. You're bringing a strange child into your house and home, and you don't know a single thing about him, nor what his disposition is like, nor what sort of parents he had, nor how he's likely to turn out. Why, it was only last week I read in a paper how a man and his wife up west of the island took a boy out of an orphan asylum, and he set fire to the house. Caden? Oh, sorry, he's pushing buttons. Oh, Caden, you little helper. Hey, you little pumpkin. And he set fire to the house at night. Set it on purpose, Marilla, and nearly burnt them to a crisp in their beds. And I know another case where an adopted boy used to suck the eggs. They couldn't break him of it. If you had asked my advice in the matter, which you didn't do, Marilla, I'd have... Okay, listen, don't. Please don't. Stop. I'd have said, for mercy's sake, not to think of such a thing. That's what. This Job's comforting seemed neither to offend nor alarm Marilla. She knitted steadily on. Do you need to not come in my video if you're going to be gross? No. I don't deny there's something in what you say, Rachel. I've had some qualms myself, but Matthew was terrible set on it. I could see that, so I gave in. It's so seldom Matthew sets his mind on anything that when he does, I always feel it's my duty to give in. And as for the risk, there's risks in pretty near everything a buddy does in this world. There's risks in people's having children of their own, if it comes to that. They don't always turn out well. And then Nova Scotia is right close to the island. It isn't as if we were getting him from England or the States. He can't be much different from ourselves. Well, I hope it will turn out all right, said Mrs. Rachel in a tone that plainly indicated her painful doubts. Only don't say I didn't warn you if he burns Green Gables down or puts strychnine in the well. I heard of a case over in New Brunswick where an orphan asylum child did that, and the whole family died in fearful agonies. Only it was a girl in that instance. Well, we're not getting a girl, said Marilla, as if poisoning wells was a purely feminine accomplishment, and not to be dreaded in the case of a boy. I'd never dream of taking a girl to bring up. I wonder at Mrs. Alexander Spencer for doing it. But there, she wouldn't shrink from adopting a whole orphan asylum if she took it into her head. Mrs. Rachel would have liked to stay until Matthew came home with his imported orphan, but reflecting that it would be a good 2 hours at least before his arrival, she concluded to go up the road to Robert Bell's and tell them the news. Ow! Ow, you're pulling my hair. Ouch. Ow. It would certainly make a sensation second to none, and Mrs. Rachel dearly loved to make a sensation. So she took herself away, somewhat to Marilla's relief, for the latter felt her doubts and fears reviving under the influence of Mrs. Rachel's pessimism. Well, of all things that ever were or will be, ejaculated Mrs. Rachel, when she was safely out in the lane, it does really seem as if I must be dreaming. Well, I'm sorry for that poor young one. Hey, what you doing? I'm sorry for that poor young one, and no mistake. What was that? Oh, you little fluff. Where did you even go? Where are you going? What you doing? Oh! Oh, he's so scary. Matthew and Marilla don't know anything about children, and they'll expect him to be wiser and steadier than his own grandfather. If so be he's ever had a grandfather, which is doubtful. Seems uncanny to think of a child at Green Gables somehow. There's never been one there, for Matthew and Marilla were grown up when the new house was built. If they ever were children, which is hard to believe when one looks at them, I wouldn't be in that orphan's shoes for anything. My, but I pity him, that's what. So said Mrs. Rachel to the wild rose bushes out of the fullness of her heart. But if she could have seen the child who was waiting patiently at the Bright River station at that very moment, her pity would have been still deeper and more profound. Okay, let's see. See how long number 2 is. Oh. More than... Let's see. This one's 9. Trying to decide. It's kind of a long one. We'll just do it. Chapter 2. Matthew Cuthbert is surprised. Matthew Cuthbert and the sorrel mare jogged comfortably over the 8 miles. Oh, hi, baby. What are you doing? Oh, there you go. Oh. You're such a silly baby. Matthew Cuthbert and the sorrel mare jogged comfortably over the 8 miles to Bright River. It was a pretty road, running along between snug farmsteads, with now and again a bit of balmy firwood to drive through, or a hollow where wild plums hung out their filmy bloom. The air was sweet with the breath of many apple orchards, and the meadows sloped away in the distance to horizon mists of pearl and purple, while the little birds sang as if it were the one day of summer in all the year. Hi. Matthew enjoyed the drive after his own fashion, except during the moments when he met women and had to nod to them. For in Prince Edward Island, you are supposed to nod to all and sundry you meet on the road, whether you know them or not. Matthew dreaded all women except Marilla and Mrs. Rachel. He had an uncomfortable feeling that the mysterious creatures were secretly laughing at him. He may have been quite right in thinking so, for he was an odd-looking personage, with an ungainly figure and long iron-gray hair that touched his stooping shoulders, and a full, soft brown beard which he had worn ever since he was 20. In fact, he had looked at 20 very much as he looked at 60, lacking a little of the grayness. Sorry, Caden's bumping the camera. When he reached Bright River, there was no sign of any train. He thought he was too early, so he tied his horse in the yard of the small Bright River Hotel and went over to the station house. The long platform was almost deserted, the only living creature in sight being a girl who was sitting on a pile of shingles at the extreme end. Matthew, barely noting that it was a girl, sidled past her as quickly as possible without looking at her. Had he looked, he could hardly have failed to notice the tense rigidity and expectation of her attitude and expression. She was sitting there waiting for something or somebody, and since sitting and waiting was the only thing to do just then, she sat and waited with all her might and main. Matthew encountered the station master locking up the ticket office preparatory to going home for supper, and asked him if the 5:30 train would soon be along. "The 5:30 train has been in and gone half an hour ago," answered that brisk official. "But there was a passenger dropped off for you, a little girl. She's sitting out there on the shingles. I asked her to go into the ladies' waiting room, but she informed me gravely that she preferred to stay outside. There was more scope for the imagination, she said. She's a case, I should say." "I'm not expecting your girl," said Matthew blankly. It's a boy I've come for. He should be here. Mrs. Alexander Spencer was to bring him over from Nova Scotia for me." The station master whistled. "Guess there's some mistake," he said. "Mrs. Spencer came off the train with that girl and gave her into my charge. Said you and your sister were adopting her from an orphan asylum and that you would be along for her presently. That's all I know about it, and I haven't got any more orphans concealed hereabouts." "I don't understand," said Matthew helplessly, wishing that Marilla was at hand to cope with the situation. "Well, you'd better question the girl," said the station master carelessly. "I dare say she'll be able to explain. She's got a tongue of her own, that's certain. Maybe they were out of the boys of the brand you wanted." He walked jauntily away, being hungry, and the unfortunate Matthew was left to do that which was harder for him than bearding a lion in its den. Walk up to a girl, a strange girl, an orphan girl, and demand of her why she wasn't a boy. Matthew groaned in spirit as he turned about and shuffled gently down the platform towards her. She had been watching him ever since he had passed her, and she had her eyes on him now. Matthew was not looking at her. "Hey, don't ride on the couch. Get a paper." Matthew was not looking at her and would not have seen what she was really like if he had been, but an ordinary observer would have seen this: a child of about 11, garbed in a very short, very tight, very ugly dress of yellowish gray wincey. She wore a faded brown sailor hat, and beneath the hat, extending down her back, were 2 braids of very thick, decidedly red hair. "Hi. I love you." You just want all Mama's attention, huh? You just want all the attention? Yeah, should I eat your teddy?
You taste like burgers. You taste like burgers, right?
Yeah, burgers. Do you taste like hamburger? Okay. Oh my goodness. Her face was small. Oh, you're so noisy. Yeah. Her face was small, white, and thin. Also much freckled. Her mouth was large, and so were her eyes, that looked green in some lights and moods, and gray in others. So far, an extraordinary observer might have seen that the chin was very pointed, and pronounced that the big eyes were full of spirit and vivacity, that the mouth was sweet-lipped and expressive, that the forehead was broad and full. In short, our discerning, extraordinary observer might have concluded that no commonplace soul inhabited the body of this stray woman-child, of whom shy Matthew Cuthbert was so ludicrously afraid. Matthew, however, was spared the ordeal of speaking first, for as soon as she concluded that he was coming to her, she stood up, grasping with one thin brown hand the handle of a shabby, old-fashioned carpet-bag. The other she held out to him. "I suppose you are Mr. Matthew Cuthbert of Green Gables," she said in a peculiarly clear, sweet voice. "I'm very glad to see you. I was beginning to be afraid you weren't coming for me, and I was imagining all the things that might have happened to prevent you. I had made up my mind that if you didn't come for me tonight, I'd go down the track to that big wild cherry tree at the bend and climb up into it to stay all night. I wouldn't be a bit afraid, and it would be lovely to sleep in a wild cherry tree, all white with bloom in the moonshine, don't you think? You could imagine you were dwelling in marble halls, couldn't you? And I was quite sure you would come for me in the morning if you didn't tonight." Matthew had taken the scrawny little hand awkwardly in his. Then and there he decided what to do. He could not tell this child with the glowing eyes that there had been a mistake. He would take her home and let Marilla do that. She couldn't be left at Bright River anyhow, no matter what mistake had been made, so all questions and explanations might as well be deferred until he was safely back at Green Gables. "I'm sorry I was late," he said shyly. "Come along, the horse is over in the yard. Give me your bag." "Oh, I can carry it," the child responded cheerfully. "It isn't heavy. I've got all my worldly goods in it, but it isn't heavy. And if it isn't carried in just a certain way, the handle pulls out, so I'd better keep it because I know the knack of it. It's an extremely old carpet bag. Oh, I'm so very glad you've come, even if it would have been nice to sleep in a wild cherry tree. We've got to drive a long piece, haven't we? Mrs. Spencer said it was 8 miles. I'm glad because I love driving. Oh, it seems so wonderful that I'm going to live with you and belong to you. I've never belonged to anybody. Not really. But the asylum was the worst." Okay, listen, please stop. "I've only been in 4 months, but that was enough. I don't suppose you were ever an orphan in an asylum." Oh, I lost my place, sorry. "So you can't possibly understand what it is like. It's worse than anything you could imagine. Mrs. Spencer said it was wicked of me to talk like that, but I didn't mean to be wicked. It's so easy to be wicked without knowing it, isn't it? They were good, you know, the asylum people, but there is so little scope for the imagination in an asylum, only just in the other orphans. It was pretty interesting to imagine things about them, to imagine that perhaps the girl who sat next to you was really the daughter of a belted earl who had been stolen away from her parents in her infancy by a cruel nurse who died before she could confess. I used to lie awake at nights and imagine things like that because I didn't have time in the day. I guess that's why I'm so thin. I am dreadful thin, ain't I? There isn't a pick on my bones. I do love to imagine I'm nice and plump with dimples in my elbows." With this, Matthew's companion stopped talking, partly because she was out of breath and partly because they had reached the buggy. Not another word did she say until they had left the village and were driving down a steep little hill, the road part of which had been cut so deeply into the soft soil that the banks, fringed with blooming wild cherry trees and slim white birches, were several feet above their heads. The child put out her hand and broke off a branch of wild plum that brushed against the side of the buggy. "Isn't that beautiful? What did that tree leaning out from the bank, all white and lacy, make you think of?" she asked. "Well, now, I don't know," said Matthew. "Why, a bride, of course. A bride all in white with a lovely misty veil. I've never seen one, but I can imagine what she would look like. I don't ever expect to be a bride myself. I'm so homely nobody will ever want to marry me. Unless it might be a foreign missionary. I suppose a foreign missionary mightn't be very particular, but I do hope that someday I shall have a white dress. That is my highest idea of earthly bliss. I just love pretty clothes, and I've never had a pretty dress in my life that I can remember. But of course it's all in the more to look forward to, isn't it? And then I can imagine that I'm dressed gorgeously. This morning, when I left the asylum, I felt so ashamed because I had to wear this horrid old wincey dress. All the orphans had. Hi. Hi. Oh. Wet. Wet. Okay. I'll jump you over. 1, 2, 3. All the orphans had to wear them, you know. A merchant in Hopetown last winter donated 300 yards of wincey to the asylum. Some people said it was because he couldn't sell it, but I'd rather believe that it was out of the kindness of his heart, wouldn't you? When we got on the train, I felt as if everybody must be looking at me and pitying me. But I just went to work and imagined that I had on the most beautiful pale blue silk dress. Because when you are imagining, you might as well imagine something worthwhile. And a big hat, all flowers and nodding plumes, and a gold watch, and kid gloves and boots. I felt cheered up right away, and I enjoyed my trip to the island with all my might. I wasn't a bit sick coming over in the boat. Neither was Mrs. Spencer, though she generally is. She said she hadn't time to get sick, watching to see that I didn't fall overboard. She said she never saw the beat of me for prowling about. But if it kept her from being seasick, it's a mercy I did prowl, isn't it? And I wanted to see everything that was to be seen on that boat because I didn't know whether I'd ever have another opportunity. Oh, there are a lot more cherry trees, all in bloom. This island is the bloomiest place. I just love it already, and I'm so glad I'm going to live here. I've always heard that Prince Edward Island was the prettiest place in the world, and I used to imagine I was living here, but I never really expected I would. It's delightful when your imaginations come true, isn't it? But these red roads are so funny. When we got into the train at Charlottetown and the red roads began to flash past, I asked Mrs. Spencer what made them red, and she said she didn't know, and for pity's sake not to ask her any more questions. She said I must have asked her 1,000 already. I suppose I had too, but how are you going to find out about things if you don't ask questions? And what does make the roads red? Hi. Hi. Mwah. Mama loves you. Where are you going? Oh, just hugs and kicking the computer. Well, now, I don't know, said Matthew. Say hi. Who's that? Is that you? I like you so much. Here. No, he just grabbed handfuls of my hair. It was kind of, not too bad. Oh, what did you find? It's a little doll. Well, that is one of the things to find out sometime. Isn't it splendid to think of all the things there are to find out about? It just, okay. It just makes me feel glad. Oh, now I lost my place. To be alive, it's such an interesting world. It wouldn't be half so interesting if we knew all about everything, would it? There'd be no scope for imagination. There'd be no scope for imagination then, would there? Caden, I'm reading. See? I'm reading. But am I talking too much? People are always telling me I do. Would you rather I didn't talk? Caden, so will you go get him one of the other books? You can't take this one. You can take a different one.
How about the one that you finished?
Okay. People are always telling me I do. Would you rather I didn't talk? If you say so, I'll stop. I can stop when I make up my mind to it, although it's difficult. Matthew, much to his own surprise, was enjoying himself. Like most quiet folks, he liked talkative people when they were willing to do the talking themselves and did not expect him to keep up his end of it. But he had never expected to enjoy the society of a little girl. Women were bad enough in all conscience, but little girls were worse. He detested the way they had of sidling past him timidly with sideways glances, as if they expected him to, hey, don't rip it. No, don't rip the book. No, be nice to the book.
We don't rip books. We take care of them.
That's right. As if they expected him to gobble them up at a mouthful if they ventured to say a word. This was the Avonlea type of well-bred little girl, but this freckled witch was very different, and although he found it rather difficult for his slower intelligence to keep up with her brisk mental processes, don't wrinkle it. He thought that he kind of liked her chatter, so he said, as shyly as usual, "Oh, you can talk as much as you like. I don't mind." "Oh, I'm so glad. I know you and I are going to get along together fine. It's such a relief to talk when one wants to and not be told that children should be seen and not heard. I've had that said to me 1,000,000 times if I have once. And people laugh at me because I use big words, but if you have big ideas, you have to use big words to express them, haven't you?" Well, now, that seems reasonable, said Matthew. Mrs. Spencer said that my tongue must be hung in the middle, but it isn't. It's firmly fastened at one end. Mrs. Spencer said your place was named Green Gables. I asked her all about it, and she said there were trees all around it. I was gladder than ever. I just love trees. And there weren't any at all about the asylum. Only a few poor weeny teeny things out in the front with little whitewashed cagey things about them. They just looked like orphans themselves, those trees did. It used to make me want to cry to look at them. I used to say to them, "Oh, you poor little things. If you were out in a great big woods with other trees all around you and little mosses and June bells growing over your roots and a brook not far away and birds singing in your branches, you could grow, couldn't you? But you can't where you are. I know just exactly how you feel, little trees. I felt sorry to leave them behind this morning. You do get so attached to things like that, don't you? Is there a brook anywhere near Green Gables? I forgot to ask Mrs. Spencer that." "Well, now, yes, there's one right below the house." Fancy! It's always been one of my dreams. Hey, to live near a brook. I never expected I would, though. Come on. I love you, baby. I love you so much. Oh, such nice love. Such nice love. Are you tired? What? You tired? You tired? You tired? You tired? You tired? Like I can see the top of your head. You tired? Mwah. Oh! Did you bump your hand? I'm sorry, baby. I'm sorry, baby. Look, who's that? Who's that, baby? Who is that?
Caden.
You ready to go to bed? I'm so tired. I love you. Okay. Dreams don't often come true, do they? Wouldn't it be nice if they did? But just now I feel pretty nearly perfectly happy. I can't say exactly perfectly happy because, well, what color would you call this? She twitched one of her long glossy braids over her thin shoulder and held it up before Matthew's eyes. Matthew was not used to deciding on the tints of ladies' tresses, but in this case there couldn't be much doubt. "It's red, ain't it?" he said. The girl let the braid drop back with a sigh that seemed to come from her very toes. And to exhale. All right, come here. You're so tired. You're so tired, huh? Yeah. You just need all the attention, huh? Okay, don't scream, Katie. Look.
Could you put this as high as that one?
Yeah, but it would take a little, it'd be a little job here. I think if you just pull it. With a sigh that seemed to come from her very toes and to exhale forth all the sorrows of the ages. Oh my goodness. I might just have to go put him to bed. He is so sad. He's still pretty sick. I probably should have just done the one chapter. But I guess we could finish tomorrow, huh? Yeah, we'll finish tomorrow. All right. We'll go put you to bed. Say goodnight. Say bye. Please say goodnight. Say bye. Good night. Bye.
He kind of looks muscular.
Oh, yeah. You say bye? You're happy now. Yeah, because you think you're going to have Mama all to yourself. Okay. Bye-bye. We will pick up tomorrow where we left off. Sorry. I do like to finish chapters, but when baby's sad, he needs mama. Huh? We'll go and we'll see you tomorrow, and we'll finish this chapter and probably read the next one. So we'll just do 1.5 for today and tomorrow. We will see you next time. Thanks for stopping by the Story Corner. Thanks for coming to story time with us. Oh, Gaden's saying bye-bye. You silly baby. All right, see you next time.
Mom, that looks like some sort of fidget toy.
Oh, it does. Are you coming to say goodnight?
Good night. Bye. Hope you had a good day.
Never.
Ah.